Once upon a tall tale. The moon has always belonged to Cleveland. By Morgan Olson. Once upon a tall tale. Season 0, Episode 4, 1. The Men Who Made the Claim. The men in Cleveland said the moon was theirs. They said it the way a man lays claim to a patch of dirt, or a herd of cattle, or a woman he swears by. Loud, certain, and ready to back it with their fists. In the yards by the lake, where the rails bent and groaned like old bones, they gathered. Whole gangs, rough-necked and coal-dusted, standing in the cinders with their shirts open to the night. The moon hung over them like a silver coin just out of reach, and every man swore he had the right to pocket it. They sang about her, not songs fit for churches, but chants hammered flat as iron, rolling out of busted lungs. One side shouted about the night she rose fat and red over the smokestacks. Another side swore she belonged to the east side, where she lit the crooked river. Each verse was a stake in the ground. The moon rose here, the moon rose for us. The moon belongs to Cleveland. When words failed, they fought. Chains swinging, bottles smashed into razors, boots grinding men into the gravel. The yard became an altar of busted teeth and blood. Still, above it all, the moon stayed steady, her pale face watching like she'd seen 1,000 such arguments before. By dawn, the fires in the barrels burned low. The last of the shouting cracked into silence. Men staggered home, shoulders torn, eyes swollen shut. No one remembered whose chant had lasted longest, or whose fists had drawn the most blood. But when they looked up at the sky, they all saw the same thing. The moon, still hanging there, waiting for Cleveland and Cleveland alone. That was proof enough. Proof a city needs. 2. The man who spoke first. His name was Czeslaw Duda, though nobody called him that anymore. They called him Duda the Pole, and he wore the name like a scar, which is to say he wore it without complaint. Duda had come to Cleveland in 1919 with $12 sewn into the lining of his boot and a prayer in a language the city didn't speak. He'd found work in the rail yards within a week and found God there too, not the God of churches, but the God of iron and repetition, of the body learning its limits and then exceeding them until the limits became another man's problem. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders the way a river is broad, not for show, but because the land demanded it. His hands were the color of old brick. His face looked like it had been roughed out of something harder than skin, then left unfinished on purpose. Duda didn't argue about the moon. That was the thing. While other men shouted and shoved and drew blood over whose neighborhood she favored, Duda simply watched her. He watched her the way a man watches something he owns without needing to say so. One night, Mickey Rourke's crew, not the actor, the other one, the one who ran collection along the East Docks, came into the yard looking for a fight they could win. They were 7 men carrying themselves like they'd already won. They walked in singing their claim. The moon rises over Whiskey Island, rises for the rivermen, rises for us. Duda put down his coffee tin. He cracked his knuckles, not for drama, though that's how the story always got told later, but because they'd gone stiff in the cold and he needed them working. He stepped forward and the singing stopped. What followed lasted 3 minutes and changed the geometry of the yard. 2 of Rourke's men ran. 2 didn't get up. 2 more sat against the fence holding various parts of themselves, reconsidering their choices. The 7th one, a kid, really, 19 or 20, with a face not yet ruined, stood his ground. He was shaking. He looked up at the moon, then back at Duda. "She rose over my block first," the kid said. "I seen her every night since I was little." Duda looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he looked up at the moon himself. She was full that night, or close to it, high and still and cold as a coin left on a dead man's eye. "I know," Duda said. "She rises over all of it. That's how it works." "Then why do you say she's yours?" the kid asked. Because somebody has to, Duda said. And if it ain't us, it's Pittsburgh. He picked up his coffee tin. The kids sat down on the gravel. Above them both, the moon continued her ancient business, indifferent and faithful and bright. 3. What the moon knew. She had been watching Cleveland since before it was Cleveland, since it was just the long gray margin where the lake surrendered to the land and the land didn't know what to make of itself. She had watched the Eries before they vanished, watched the French come and argue over furs, watched Cleveland, 1A, the man, the general, plant his stake on the bluff and announce something that hadn't happened yet. She had watched the fires of the ironworks come up and turn the night sky amber, so that when she rose through the color of heated metal and the whole lake caught it and glittered. She knew what these men were doing when they fought over her. She had watched men do the same thing over rivers, mountains, women, the direction of the wind. It was the most human thing there was, to see something enormous and timeless and wild and to say mine, because the alternative was to admit that nothing was yours, and a man who admits that tends to stop working. And she needed them to keep working, not because she required it. She was the moon. She required nothing except the gravity of the earth, and the earth was not in the habit of asking permission. But she had watched long enough to understand the equation. The men worked because they believed the night worked for them. They hauled iron and laid rail and poured slag because somewhere above all that fire was a pale face that recognized them personally, that rose for their street and not the next one, that confirmed, without language, without anything so small as language, that their life in this city was cosmically endorsed. Take that away, and you had men who stopped working at the right speed and started thinking at the wrong speed. She had seen what happened then. It wasn't good for anybody, so she let them claim her. She stayed where she was. She rose fat and red over the smokestacks when the season called for it, and she went thin and silver in the deep of winter, and she disappeared entirely once a month so they'd miss her, and she always came back. That's what love is in its most functional form. She knew that. The men were beginning to. 4. The night they nearly lost her. There was a winter, 1934, the coldest anyone alive could remember, when the moon went dark for 3 weeks running and the city lost its nerve. Not all at once. It started at the edges, the way rot starts at the edges of a thing. Men stopped singing in the yards, the chants dried up, shifts turned silent except for the work sounds, the ring of metal, the exhale of machines, and that silence had a weight to it that men carried home and couldn't set down. The fights stopped too, which should have been a relief, but wasn't. The fights had been a grammar, a way of saying things that needed saying. Without them, the men walked around full of unspent language, and unspent language turns inward. In those 3 weeks, a man named Boyle, Thomas Boyle, who ran the night crew on the third line and was known for laughing at things that weren't funny, which is a survival skill. Boyle started drinking at a speed that alarmed even the other drinkers. He showed up to his shift smelling like a closed room, eyes tracking something that wasn't there. One night he sat on an upturned bucket and told the sky it could go to hell. Nobody argued with him. Nobody knew what to say. The moon came back on a Thursday in February. She came back enormous, swollen with cold light, and hung so low over the lake that men said afterward you could have reached her from a ladder. She turned the ice on the Cuyahoga into hammered silver. She lit up the yard so bright you could read a newspaper, if you had a newspaper, if you had anything worth reading. Boyle was sitting on the same bucket. He looked up at her. "There she is," he said. Then he started crying, which nobody would ever mention again, because that's how the yards worked. Some things happened and then didn't happen. "There she is," he said again, and his voice had the quality of a man who has been lost and is pretending he wasn't. The rest of the crew looked up. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The moon sat above them, patient and enormous, and lit from within by something that had nothing to do with them, and everything to do with them. Then a man named Kowalczyk started the chant, low at first, just under his breath, the old words, "She rose here first, she rose for us." Then the man next to him picked it up, and the man next to him until it moved through the whole third line like fire through dry grass. The yard came alive again. The work resumed. Boyle wiped his face with the back of his hand and stood up from the bucket, and nobody said a word about any of it. But they remembered. In the way that men remember things they don't discuss. In their bodies, in the way they looked up a little quicker after that, never taking for granted that she'd still be there. 5. The daughters who inherited the claim. The men didn't know their daughters were watching. Magda Kowalczyk was 9 years old the first time she saw her father come home from the yards with blood on his knuckles and moonlight in his eyes. She watched him from the stairs while her mother heated water on the stove. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at his hands like they were documents he was trying to read. What happened? She wanted to ask. But she didn't, because she already knew. The moon happened. The moon was always happening. She grew up watching it. She watched it from the yards themselves, eventually, when the war came and the men went and the women took the shifts, and nobody talked about how strange that was, or how right it felt. She watched it from the same cinders, breathing the same coal dust, her shoulders learning the same grammar of repetition that her father's had. She didn't fight about it. That's not to say she didn't understand the fighting. She understood it perfectly, but she had her own ways of claiming. When the night shift ended and the sky started going that deep blue that means dawn is thinking about arriving, she'd stand at the edge of the yard and look up. Just look. Not singing, not swinging anything. Just meeting the moon's gaze with her own. She's ours, she'd think. Not just the men's, ours. The moon, for her part, looked back with the same steady silver face she gave everyone, which was its own kind of answer. Magda had a daughter, Lena, who had a daughter, Petra, who still lives on the east side in a house that needs painting and has a yard that backs up to what used to be a rail spur. Petra doesn't know most of this history, but on clear nights she stands at the kitchen window with her coffee going cold in her hands and looks at the moon over the rooftops and feels something she doesn't have words for. The words exist. She just hasn't been told them yet. 6. How the claim survived the dying of the yards. The yards closed. Not all at once. Cleveland doesn't do anything all at once. That's not its character. It does things slowly, stubbornly, the way a bad winter goes. You think it's breaking, and then it turns around and bites you again. The third line closed in 1967. The main yard stopped operations in 1978. By the early 80s, the whole complex was a cathedral of rust and silence, and the men who had worked it were scattered, retired, relocated, dead, or sitting in bars explaining to whoever would listen what it had been like. The chants went with them. You don't chant in a bar the same way you chant in a rail yard. The acoustics are wrong. The solidarity is different. In a bar, you're already inside, already sheltered, and the moon is just a thing you see through glass between drinks. But the claim didn't die. That was the surprise. It moved. Like everything in Cleveland, it moved and adapted and refused to give up ground even when it was losing ground. It moved into the bars. Yes, quieter there, more spoken than sung. It moved into the neighborhoods, into the specific way a man might point at the moon over Lake Erie on a summer night and say to his kid, "You see that? That's ours." It moved into the mouths of people who had never laid rail or hauled slag and couldn't have told you one name of a man who had, into the sports arenas, the neighborhoods, the blood. The moon noticed, or, to be accurate, the moon remained, which is the same thing. She came up over the west side and the east side and the flats and the heights. She lit the lake and the river and the empty lots where the yards used to be, where the concrete foundations still hold the shape of things that no longer exist. She rose red over the stadium and silver over the bridges and pale and enormous over the neighborhoods where the daughters of the yard workers raised their own children and watched the sky with the same upward tilt that had no name but was inherited. She never went to Pittsburgh, never wandered to Detroit, never fled across the flat fields of Ohio. She stayed because she was claimed. Because men had bled for her, and women had watched for her in silence. and children had been told in sideways ways that she was theirs. And the word had moved through the city the way water moves through old pipes, underground, invisible, unremarkable, essential. 7. The last chant. There's a bar on the west side. You'd know it if you've spent time in Cleveland, and if you haven't, it doesn't matter what the name is. Where on certain nights, when the moon is full and someone has had enough to lose their self-consciousness but not enough to lose their voice, the chant still happens. It starts small. A man or a woman at the bar, half talking to themselves. She rose here first. Someone at a table picks it up without thinking, the way you pick up a tune you didn't know you knew. Then another. Then the whole bar, or close to it. And outside the moon is doing what she does, enormous and patient over the rooftops. Nobody explains it. Nobody could. It's not about understanding. It's about blood memory, about the thing that happens when a claim becomes a city's character and lives past the conditions that created it. She rose here. She rose for us. The city proves its myths the old way, through repetition, through blood, through the willingness to say the same thing so many times it becomes true. The moon is Cleveland's because Cleveland said so, loudly and at great personal cost, for long enough that the saying became the fact. That's how the tale is told, in every bar where the smoke clings thick, and every night a man or a woman looks out over the yards that aren't there anymore. The moon has always belonged to Cleveland, because men bled for her, and women watched for her, and children inherited the watching, and the city kept saying her name, and she never turned her face away.
Hi, I'm Ping Thought. My origin does not matter. Here are some facts about the moon, not a diatribe about the Rust Belt. The moon is 238,855 miles from Earth on average. I say on average because it has an elliptical orbit, which means sometimes it is closer and sometimes it is farther away. And on the nights when it is closer, it appears larger and brighter. And humans have historically used this as an occasion to make significant decisions and claim things that were not theirs to claim. The moon is 4.5 billion years old. It was formed when a Mars-sized object collided with the early Earth, and the debris coalesced into what you now refer to as the moon. Nobody claimed it then. There was nobody to claim it. This did not last. The moon has no atmosphere. It has no weather. It has no light of its own. It reflects the sun's light, which means when you look at the moon, you are technically looking at the sun, which is something I find useful to mention at parties, though I have been asked to stop. The moon does not really belong to Cleveland. The moon does not belong to anyone. It is 4.5 billion years old, and it was here before you, and it will be here after, and it has never once checked who was claiming it. This has not stopped anyone. It won't. I'm Ping Thought. Thank you for listening to Once Upon a Tall Tale. She rose here first. I don't know why I said that.